definite hyperpituitary. Minus 65. That accounts for his great size. No human heart could possibly function like that. Especially in his condition. It's beating at over 250 to the minute. He's completely superhuman.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Unfortunately, Rocco will not be able to join us tonight on our first foray into Universal's second wave of horror movies, which began in earnest in 1939 after a 3-year lull in the genre following its Hollywood golden age from 1931 to 1936. My father and I only began extensively exploring the rise and fall of sound horror films during season 2 of the podcast, but I had already begun alluding to the ins and outs of how one cycle of film horror ended and how another would begin as far back as September 19th of 2020 with our episode on the 1939 British horror film The Dark Eyes of London. And though we would have time to explore many different topics before concluding Season 2, including a more diverse exploration of the horror golden age at studios like Universal, a spate of dinosaur flicks, as well as a special series on the recent Warner Brothers Legendary Pictures Monsterverse franchise, it's really this theme, the transition from one horror cycle to another, that I'm the most eager to get back to. I deliberately left my listeners hanging with our impromptu bonus episode on Universal's 1935 film The Raven from November 30th of last year, describing the significance of how that film tested and ultimately broke the boundaries of good taste that the horror film, since its inception as a coherent cinematic genre, had always treaded dangerously during a period of ever-increasing demand for either direct government regulation of motion pictures or more rigorous industry self-censorship.
Bateman.
Are you ready to do it for me, Bateman?
Fix my mouth.
You're monstrously ugly. Your monstrous ugliness breeds monstrous hate. Good. I can use your hate. You will do this for me, Bateman.
Fix my mouth.
I'll fix your mouth, Bateman.
Do it. Change me.
I change you, Bateman. You will look good. The way you wish.
Make me look good.
First, you must do this job for me, Bateman. I can't use my hand to do it. Your hand is used to torture. Your hand must do it. My brain, your hand.
Though a financial success, The Raven was ravaged by critics and banned in several countries outright. It was particularly controversial in the United Kingdom, where the film quickly became trumpeted in the press and by censors as a new low for our popular attractions, offensive just as much for the evidently visceral glee it took in languishing in themes of sadism and torture as for its abandon of any kind of artistic pretense. Indeed, and as Dad and I covered on our episode on the film, more than its bastardization of the Immortal poem by Edgar Allan Poe, both the budget and direction of The Raven is a far cry from the prestigious, stylized exuberance that had dominated the conception of the horror film in the early 30s. If only for its apparent novelty, though certainly with the smash success of Todd Browning's Dracula for grounding it all. The horror film from its outset had been a venue through which often unseasoned directors could explore the darkest depths of human nature in a aesthetically sophisticated fashion that might, at the very least, help in mollifying charges that these works were gratuitous at best and socially dangerous at worst. Though smaller studios and Poverty Row outfits would rush to capitalize on the cycle, perceptions of the new genre were defined by major studio releases with an A-picture seal of prestige. Whether we're talking about James Whale's 2 Frankenstein films, Ruben Mamoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack's King Kong, the controversy that these works often aroused were nonetheless matched by exciting, groundbreaking feats of special effects, cinematography, editing, and film scoring that attested to the horror film's artistic legitimacy. Even less well-received works among the major studio B-tier, such as Robert Florey's Murders in the Rue Morgue, Edgar G. Ulmer's The Black Cat, and Michael Curtiz's Mystery of the Wax Museum, were backed by ingenious personal visions on the part of the director. The same cannot be said for The Raven, which, directed by Lou Landers, lavishes its cinematic attention not on technical innovation, but on the delicious torture planned and executed by star Bela Lugosi in full ham mode.
You will live in this place forever and ever. It will be the perfect marriage, the perfect love. You will never be separated, never. Bateman! Bateman! Come on, Bateman, close it! Forever and ever. What happens in that room? Another one of false devices, Bateman. It's the room where the walls come together. Doesn't take long, Bateman, until they're crushed, dead.
The horror cycle had of course seen its fair share of controversies before The Raven. Notably, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's Freaks had proved to be a full-blown PR disaster, so injuring its prestigious reputation that the studio was compelled to effectively disown the $300,000 debacle, locking it in a vault before allowing exploitation pioneer Dwayne Esper to purchase the rights to the film in 1947. If controversy weren't enough, the apparent financial no-brainer in hopping on the horror bandwagon proved to be a more dubious proposition than many of Universal's competitors might have anticipated. Paramount's equally expensive Island of Lost Souls, for instance, proved to be both a critical and financial disappointment, and was ravaged by state and local censors, with the firm establishment of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America's Production Code Authority in 1935, re-releasing the film without cuts that made its story borderline incomprehensible became its own nightmare. A struggling studio like RKO might find themselves to be the proud parents of an icon like King Kong, but one or two hits could do little to compensate for the overall shaky financial situation of Hollywood at a time of declining theater attendance, both due to the economic shortfall of the Great Depression, as well as organized boycotts by religious activist groups like the Catholic Legion of Decency. Even at Universal, the House of Horror itself, the untold story behind economic success was that horror movies frequently languished in development, whereas more established genres were easier to turn around even at the A-picture level. What's more, these productions had a habit, even at the B level, of going over schedule and over budget. It should have been obvious even in this nascent period that any financially fruitful future for the genre would have to be made at a more calculated and mercenary level. Ironically, The Raven appears to predict just that. Landers' production is, for all its good points, effectively a Poverty Row thriller with major studio refinements. But before the horror film could be truly reborn as another vein in the hallowed B-movie tradition, it would need to expire. crushed by the slouching weight of market oversaturation and the outdated expectations and practices of old studio regimes. The first blow would come from the effective elimination of 40% of the horror film's foreign box office via the British Board of Film Censors' establishment of the H certificate, a rating designated expressly for films deemed to be too horrific to be presented to any audiences where individuals under the age of 16 are present. Though horror films were not technically banned in the UK, this ephemerally charged rating was enough to scare off most exhibitors who, either independently or following the express regulation of local town councils, refused to screen films that did not receive the U certificate, i.e., a certificate guaranteeing universal exhibition regardless of age. For most of the major studios whose luck with horror films had not been nearly as consistent as Universal, this curtailing of markets would have been enough to dissuade the development of future horror projects. Meanwhile, at Universal itself, the de facto British ban did little to curb the studio's regular production of horror films. Even with the fate of the studio and its leadership hanging in the balance, development pressed forward on another team-up of horror icons Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff to follow the success of The Raven, as well as a long-awaited sequel to Dracula. But despite some rather impressive financial hits, The Raven among them, the now 68-year-old founder and owner of Universal, Carl Laemmle, and his 35-year-old son, studio president Carl Laemmle Jr., had little reason to feel confident about the future of horror films specifically, much less the future of their control over the studio in general. In the last 5 years, the studio had only managed to turn a profit twice. Once in 1931, with over half of its nearly $500,000 earnings being directly attributable to the success of Dracula, and again in 1934, with much of its nearly $250,000 earnings being directly attributable to the Bela Lugosi-Boris Karloff team-up vehicle, The Black Cat. Overall, however, the tenure of the Junior Laemmle's control of Universal's productions had been marked by financial disasters. Having accepted the reins of the studio from his nepotistic father at the tender age of 21 years old, he had found himself in the unenviable position of captaining a major studio ship at a time of both dramatic technological advancement and economic unease. Which is to say that, in the annals of great Hollywood screw-ups, not all of the studio's injuries could be laid at the feet of the young upstart. Indeed, from a certain perspective, Carl Laemmle Jr. was in an impossible situation from the jump. For one, it would have been imperative anyway for the studio to undergo fairly rapid modernization commensurate with its recalcitrant founder's persistent lack of interest in pursuing more extensive use of synchronized sound and color film processing, and keeping contemporary costs a lot of money. At the same time, the Junior Laemmle was clearly driven just as much by his own imperative to be considered, as it were, a great filmmaker. He had come into adulthood at a time when the old guard of motion picture luminaries were coming increasingly under the influence, or were on the verge of being pushed into the margins by, a newer, younger breed. Icons such as Marcus Lowe, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, Adolf Zukor, William Fox, and Laemmle's own father had been part of a generation of predominantly Jewish immigrants to the east coast of North America at the turn of the century. They had latched onto the motion picture industry as a pathway into high society that they perceived as absent of the sort of nativist barriers to be encountered in other areas of American industry. Spearheaded by the senior Laemmle himself, they had become the motion picture independents to challenge the old Edison Trust, and they had shrewdly moved the epicenter of film production to sunny California. In time, they had become the new titans of the film industry, commanding vast vertically integrated networks of production, distribution, and exhibition to shatter and replace the hegemony of the Edison Trust almost entirely. But always along the way, with rare exception, these classic strivers of the American dream had been conscious of good business above all. They had a much greater interest in turning over product quickly and making back capital than they did in the artistic potential of filmmaking itself. But the generation of Laemmle's son was increasingly one that believed that what had become Hollywood should strive, at least occasionally, to make tasteful films, not just economical ones. Able to build upon the strides made by their new immigrant predecessors, they were, for lack of a better term, cultured to a degree that the previous generation were not. Again, part of this generational shift may have been more a matter of the mandate of systemic and cultural forces than the individual will of its luminaries. As clarion calls for film censorship became ever stronger, it would become ever more in the interests of film executives to be more diligent, more discriminating in how they invested their money, if only to reinforce the plausible deniability against the charge that Hollywood was a traffic in prurient entertainment for susceptible minds. And though likely nobody in the early 20s could have predicted the waning theater attendance of the Great Depression, the philosophy of flooding a strategically anti-competitive market with quickly turned-over product could under no circumstances have remained a sustainable option. The majors would have to eventually invest more of their capital in fewer productions that could continue to maintain mass audience interest in films. If that meant investing in modern technical gimmickry like sound and color, or if that meant strategically concentrating the best of studio talent on the production of a few prestige pictures that sought to both make most of the studio's big returns on investment as well as boost the company's profile among critics, it more or less worked out to the same thing anyway. If any one name shadowed the younger Laemmles' consciousness when he was appointed president of Universal Pictures on April 28, 1929, it was Irving Thalberg. Preceding Darryl Zanuck and David O. Selznick, Thalberg had been the first of the industry's boy wonders. He first began working in Universal's New York offices as a secretary in 1918 at the age of 19 years old. In a short period of time, the elder Laemmle had made the gregarious Thalberg his personal secretary. With Laemmle now increasingly receding into the background of Universal as a figurehead, the now 20-year-old Thalberg moved from New York to Universal City, where he went to work scrutinizing studio operations, noting inefficiencies, and preparing Laemmle for his ideas on how to transform the studio from an independent stalwart into an industry leader. Within 6 months, Thalberg had been promoted to studio manager, taking total command of Universal Pictures' film production operations. It was Thalberg who would end up bringing actor Lon Chaney into the studio fold and, as his first major gamble in producing prestige pictures, execute a lavish feature adaptation of Victor Hugo's 1831 novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Taking over a year to produce at a budget exceeding $1.25 million, Hunchback proved to be a massive hit, grossing roughly $3.5 million. With Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, now a certified international star, The Hunchback would be followed, without Thalberg, with another prestigious literary adaptation, The Phantom of the Opera, in 1925. These two pictures, with their prototypical exploitations of film horror, would prove a heavy influence upon Junior Laemmle's pursuit of gothic subject matter for his own ambitious slate of prestige pictures. Thalberg was eventually lured away by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, his Midas touch seeming to work the same wonders at that studio as it had at Universal. Laemmle, on the other hand, could only aspire to the same gifts as his boy wonder rivals. Indeed, if he ever saw himself as being engaged in a rivalry with the pseudo-sibling in the form of his father's former right-hand man, this was purely imagined. The real rivalry, if there was one, was between Thalberg and Selznick, who did not simply have grand aspirations, but were also innovators. Thalberg completely reorganized Universal long before Laemmle set a firm foot into technical control of the studio, and introduced to both it and MGM now standard procedures of modern motion picture development, including story conferences and sneak previews. For his own part, Selznick, as a production chief at RKO, introduced a unit production system that gave greater independence to individual associate producers over film productions. In the case of both, Thalberg and Selznick exercised considerably more diligence than their predecessors in micromanaging the progress of their films from page to screen, intent not just on making money, but on leaving an indelible personal print on the films associated with them. Though the junior Laemmle had similar ambitions, his role in the actual day-to-day operations of Universal and even its most prestigious films was not nearly as active as his contemporaries. For what it's worth, his professional and personal reputation was also not nearly as sterling as Thalberg and Selznick. One might chalk it up to bitterness over the clear nepotism involved in his appointment at such a young age, but by many accounts, the junior Laemmle was prone to outbursts, not particularly bright, a poor communicator, and kind of a possessive creep when it came to certain starlets he fancied. But his tenure as Universal's guiding spirit is certainly commendable if taken strictly at the level of his necessary bucking of his own father's conservative worldview to not only modernize the studio and invest increasingly in prestige productions, but also to bring the horror genre into fully articulated being. Ambition alone, though, cannot compensate for lack of business sense, and the writing was on the wall within less than a year of the junior Laemmle taking command. Leading the charge of his prestige endeavors were two major undertakings. The first, a lavish revue musical called King of Jazz, starring Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, a clear riff on the jazz singer. The second, an epic adaptation of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. The costs associated with both films proved to be so heavy that, in order to conserve finances, Universal City temporarily shut down all operations in March 1930. By April, a number of staff were laid off, and executives were compelled to work full-time at half salary. All Quiet on the Western Front would prove to be a critical and commercial success, but King of Jazz proved to be such a critical and financial disaster that the losses of the latter offset the gains of the former. Universal would conclude the fiscal year 1930 with a loss of over $2.6 million, the worst deficit in its corporate history. Flashing forward to the end of the fiscal year 1935, the studio was still running at a deficit of over $500,000, which, when thought of another way, means that in 5 years, Laemmle had managed to make the studio about $2 million. At this point, Universal stockholders had had enough. When the Laemmles proposed to embark on yet another risky prestige venture, an all-talky remake of the 1929 film Showboat, they balked, insisting that if the father-son duo wanted the capital to fund another financial disaster, they would have to obtain a production loan from an outside investor for the first time in the company's 26-year history. Enter Charles R. Rogers. Rogers had been an independent producer in the film industry since the early 20s. He briefly served as RKO's head of production in 1931 before moving on to producing films for Paramount. In 1935, he suddenly found himself acting as an intermediary between the Standard Capital Corporation and Universal. In exchange for a $750,000 loan from Standard Capital, the Laemmles put up their controlling interest in the studio as collateral. Showboat sailed and sank. With an already hefty price tag, the production went $300,000 over budget. Standard Capital called the loan, and by March 14, 1936, the Laemmles were out and Universal was under new management. Rogers himself took the position of vice president in charge of production. Standard Capital board member J. Cheever Cowden was installed as chairman of the board, and original Universal co-founder Robert H. Cochran was promoted to corporate president. Under Rogers and Cowden's stewardship, Universal saw its production significantly scaled back to focus almost exclusively on low-budget programmers, musicals, comedies, action films, etc. This new management was also, however, particularly hostile to horror films, and with the wind of the British ban at their backs, they either shelved or canceled all future horror projects. Quote the Raven, the horror film was, for the time being at least, nevermore. Revival of the Fittest. Frank S. Nugent, writing for the New York Times, published May 8, 1938. Now that the star system has come under adverse critical scrutiny, Hollywood can feel that its cup of hemlock is filled to the brim and waiting to be quaffed. Of course, the potion added by the Independent Theater Owners Association last week was not as deadly as it might have seemed. Although the ITOA objects to the high salaries being paid to certain stars who allegedly have outworn their box office welcome, it has no objection to the high salaries paid to the players who have not. And it adds, quote, "We are not against the star system." Thus, the ITOA's protest for all the headlines it received can be dismissed merely as a businessman's grousing over an unwise investment. Beneath the incivility and the illogic of the diatribe, however, there was one valid suggestion. It was that producers concentrate on making good pictures instead of, quote, surrounding a $5,000 a week star with any sort of vehicle. There is the nub of the whole problem, for it has been the practice of foisting a bad script on a good player which has brought Hollywood and its star system into disrepute and has begun to spread red ink across the industry's ledgers. It has taken the public a long time to discover what this year's drop in theater attendance attests, that the presence of big names in the case is no guarantee of a good picture. When filmgoers find they cannot even depend on Myron Loy, William Powell, Carol Lombard, Brian Ahern, Marlene Dietrich, Betty Davis, and W.C. Fields, then nothing is sacred. And the worst of it is that they vent their indignation, as the ITOA is doing now, on the players rather than on the producers, and word gets around that so-and-so is, quote, poison at the box office. There is no gainsaying the fact that the public's taste changes. In the natural course of events, some players will rise and others fall in popularity. It is true, too, that some of them seem to be equally impervious to the ravages of time and script. Little Mistress Temple has been public hero number 1 for the last 3 years, and no one would accuse her of having a George Kaufman in her literary corner. But generally speaking, stars are no better and no worse than their material. They stand at the mercy of their scripts, and when the scripts are habitually unkind, their public will be unkinder still. A quick survey of the current Broadway pictures reveals, as usual, that the material at the player's disposal is none too good. Possibly we do our worst by reporting that the most entertaining of the newcomers is not a newcomer at all, but a reissue of The Count of Monte Cristo, which was one of the best 10 of 1934. Being a costume melodrama, it holds up easily, and as easily overmatches the 1938 items in its vicinity. It is a harbinger, too, of pleasant things to come, for the industry, hard put for product, plans to reissue other old favorites during the summer months. Here's how the legend goes. Having been established only a little under a year prior by local businessman Joseph DeBall, the Regina Theater at 8556 Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills was in dire straits by the summer of 1938. In an effort to stave off bankruptcy, DeBall drummed up an extravagant triple feature of horror classics. Frankenstein, Dracula, and Son of Kong began playing nightly at the Regina on August 5th, and the program began drawing immense crowds almost immediately. In an October interview with the New York World Telegram, actor Bela Lugosi commented, quote, "One day I drove past and see my name, and big lines of people all around. I wonder what is giving away to the people, maybe bacon or vegetables, but it is the comeback of horror." A non-native actor who was already entering his 50s when the original Dracula made him an international star, Lugosi had already found himself slumming it during the Depression years in role after thankless role as a heavy in big screen shockers. Now, with the death of the first horror cycle, his career had been virtually destroyed. He hadn't acted in a film in over a year, when, in those weeks of August, with the Regina's triple bill continuing to play to sell out crowds, he was invited to make personal appearances nightly. He would find himself making similar appearances at other theaters as well as horror film revivals caught on throughout Los Angeles. Meanwhile, at Universal, the excommunication of the Laemmles and the refocusing on a tighter production schedule of lower-budget films had apparently done little to right the studio's financial ship. The studio ended the fiscal year of 1937 with a loss a smidge over $1 million, and by November, Robert H. Cochran was out as corporate president, replaced by Nate Bloomberg, formerly a theater operator of RKO. Charles R. Rogers would himself resign as vice president in charge of production on May 20th, 1938, succeeded by another RKO veteran, Cliff Work. Slowly but surely, the studio's red line financial prospects seemed to be improving, in that by October 1938, they were now finishing out the fiscal year at a loss of a tad over $500,000 rather than a tad over $1 million. The success of the Regina Theater triple bill and similar engagements in the summer and fall was enough, however, to perk up the ears of a previously horror-adverse studio regime. Capitalizing on the success of the revival screening, Universal ordered new prints of Frankenstein and Dracula to be toured as a double feature. The local phenomenon was repeated on a national scale, and the studio's new authorities were compelled to reckon with two factors. The first was the apparently lingering appetite for the weird and supernatural that had laid dormant among the American public in the intervening years since the first horror cycle had ended in 1936 in response to the British ban. The second was the extent to which analysis of audience attendance of these revivals noted the sizable number of young people who, though too young to have seen the films when they first came out, were beholding the grim visages of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff for the first time. This new crop of youngsters and teenagers clearly represented a fresh and antsy public, underserved in the intervening 2 years, and eager to have their blood chilled and their spines tingled. Hence, the studio moved quickly to mount what would be their first new horror release in 2 years. While the performance of the Regina Theater triple feature was certainly the final word in convincing Universal to fast-track a return to horror, the true story of how supernatural chillers came back into vogue in the years immediately preceding the Second World War is just a tad more complicated and less sexy than the legend. Indeed, Universal's re-releases of Frankenstein and Dracula had begun much earlier that summer. They had, at the very least, announced their intentions of reissuing Frankenstein, as well as 3 other hits, All Quiet on the Western Front, Lady Tubbs, and Love Before Breakfast, as early as April of the same year. These revivals were announced in the context of a press release attributed to Charles R. Rogers, who was soon to be on his way out, mapping out Universal's current plan to release 40 new films over the 1938-1939 film season. While 40 new films may sound like a lot, this actually represented a significant reduction in output consistent with the new standard capital regime's mandate to bring the studio's finances in line. A New York Times summary from May 11 reports, quote, "In his statement, Mr. Rogers characterized the hard and fast production schedule as an outmoded and dangerous procedure for any studio, and pointed out that Universal's schedule would be kept flexible at all times, quote, so that we may obtain stories and personalities that meet the public taste." Note the point about keeping the studio's production schedule flexible there. Inherent to the legend of the war-era horror cycle is the idea that Universal's new top brass were snobbishly horror-averse, that there were cultural as well as economic motives to putting the beast to bed, and that only the chimes of cold hard cash were enough to push them to fan the flames of fear anew. While perhaps true to a certain degree, the reality is that any self-respecting studio executive had little reason to write off horror films completely, even with the massive strictures placed upon international box office by the British ban. Though Hollywood had struggled to capture the same success that the Laemmles had had with their individual horror vehicles, the fact was that throughout the 1930s, there remained a canny interest in these sorts of pictures. For Universal in particular, the industry leader in the horror cycle, the financial ineptitude of the previous regime didn't really have anything to do with horror films not being successful. Indeed, throughout the Junior Laemmles' reign, horror films had consistently been some of the studio's biggest money earners, particularly if executives were able to effectively package their projects with familiar stars of the new genre like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. If anything had killed horror, it was a significant but nonetheless culturally concentrated backlash that was, in turn, in some ways a direct consequence of the failure of major studios to respond to growing moral crusades against motion pictures by effectively self-regulating violent and lascivious content in their films. One also can't discount simple oversaturation. One major studio had struck gold with Dracula and Frankenstein, and then everybody from the heights of MGM and Paramount to the lows of the poverty row rushed in to cynically cash in with works that were superficially similar to, but ultimately diluted the novelty of what had come before it. It is most likely that, far from being horror-averse, the new Universal regime had just decided to keep itself, in a word, flexible. The horror cycle had run its course, and what horror films had come before had, as I stated before, tended to follow convoluted development and production tracks that, even if the films were successful, were horrifically inefficient in terms of their consumption of studio time and resources. Yet the films themselves, especially the early ones, remained fixtures of collective consciousness. And the stars associated with them, even if they, like Bela Lugosi, had hit rocky roads indeed, remained inordinately popular. It is more likely that, far from being horror-averse, the standard capital regime at Universal simply determined that, in the interest of being flexible, horror could be placed on the back burner for at least a bit, until such time as mass enthusiasm had been strategically teased and built up again. And most importantly, executives could find an internally economical process of producing these horror films. Rogers' stated retirement of the hard and fast production schedule at Universal was reflected in the motion picture industry at large. With an overall decline in theater attendance, studios began producing less films, and thus increasingly relied on revivals of their older films to pad out their release schedules. This decline in theater attendance and the popularity of the revivals may not have simply been a function of lingering depression blues. As the previously quoted Frank S. Nugent piece conveys, there was at least some broad sense among movie fans of the late 30s that the output of the motion picture industry was in steady qualitative decline, and that the most beloved films of only a few years ago were much preferred to what were seen as Hollywood's incompetent attempts to win audiences back through pandering. In this context, revivals may have served a twofold purpose. In the first, studios could stand to make a considerable amount of money by banking on a previous hit, which only required the striking of a few new film prints, not the mounting of an entirely new production. What's more, depending on how old this film was, it potentially stood to capture a younger audience to whom it would have appeared entirely novel, as the revivals of Frankenstein and Dracula had. In the second fold, revivals themselves could be used to test the waters of what kinds of new pictures the studios should invest in. The Regina Theater showing certainly pushed Universal over the edge to quickly produce a new horror film, but they had already been testing the waters, or some might say priming the pump, for a horror revival. Indeed, there is enough circumstantial historical evidence to support a completely contrary interpretation of events, that the Regina Theater revival was itself inspired by Universal and other studios' attempts to recapitalize upon previously produced films, not the other way around. Supporting this interpretation of events is the fact that, in addition to reissuing Dracula and Frankenstein, Universal executives were already kicking around the idea of remaking one of their older horror films, with suggestions including James Whale's The Old Dark House from 1932, and, of all choices, The Raven, to again star Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. But when opening night reports of their Frankenstein revival exceeded the box office results of its original release in some localities, and after the film and Dracula had played to sold-out audiences for 5 consecutive weeks at a small theater in Beverly Hills that summer, the logical choice for a comeback was obvious. On August 29th, The Hollywood Reporter announced that Universal planned to produce a sequel to Frankenstein as part of a 2-picture deal they were negotiating with Boris Karloff. In a feat of dramatic irony that surely must have left Carl Laemmle Jr. feeling at least a tad vindicated in his own abilities as a production head, what was supposed to be a quick cash-in project turned into one of the studio's most protracted and expensive productions of the 1930s. Fine-tuned by its director Rowland V. Lee right down to the wire, the first horror film in 3 years finally premiered on January 13th, 1939.
He's alive!
Son of Frankenstein picks up some decades after the events of the previous 1935 film Bride of Frankenstein, though by the looks of things not a day has passed in the old Bavarian village. Having lived in the cursed shadow of the previous Baron Frankenstein's infernal experiments in raising the dead, the city fathers are none too eager to welcome Henry's son, Wolf von Frankenstein, played by Basil Rathbone. Wolf, himself a successful scientist, is relocating to the village with his wife Elsa, Josephine Hutchinson, and young son Peter, Donnie Dunnigan, intent on reclaiming his barony and, in time, restoring the good name of Frankenstein in both the town and the world over. Upon his arrival, the village burgomaster, bound by duty and procedure, hands Wolf a locked box guaranteed to him by his father's will. Settling at the grim, virtually empty castle, Wolf discovers that the box contains the secrets to the late Frankenstein's experiments. Anticipating that fate will find the sins of the father falling upon the son, Inspector Krogh, Lionel Atwill, the crippled chief of the town gendarme whose arm was torn out of its socket by the monster as a child, gracefully cautions Wolf against discounting the past and local superstitions. Of particular foreboding is his account of a series of 6 unsolved murders of the village's prominent elders that have gone on since the monster's apparent destruction. All of the victims had died of violent concussions, but their autopsies also revealed a far more horrific commonality between them. Their hearts had all burst, as if, indeed, had they not been killed by injuries to the skull and brain, they might have died simply of fright. The villagers, of course, attribute the murders to a spirit, which they, in turn, commonly give the name Frankenstein. Priding himself in leading a life without fear, Wolf convinces himself that his father's errors were not his own, blaming the monster's rampage on his bumbling assistant's stealing of a criminal as opposed to a normal brain. But even before he can have fresh equipment set up in the crumbling ruins of his father's old laboratory, he discovers lurking around inside the ghoulish figure of Igor, played by none other than Bela Lugosi. A running macabre gag throughout the film is that Igor himself, like the monster, is technically neither dead nor alive. Having already been found guilty by the town elders of stealing bodies from graves, he was condemned to death and hung, but the noose only managed to snap his neck, leaving the already ugly creature with his head displaced by the neck bone protruding out from underneath the skin. The diabolical Igor leads Wolf into the catacombs hidden underneath the laboratory, where both his father and grandfather are entombed. And on the slab where Wolf's own coffin should rest, Igor reveals the body of the monster, having apparently survived the explosion at the end of Bride of Frankenstein. And yes, the monster is played once again, and for the final time, by Boris Karloff. His only companion now in a deep coma, Igor feeds upon Wolf's ego and convinces him to help break old Sleeping Beauty out of his slumber. Wolf reestablishes his father's laboratory and successfully revives the monster, but the brash young doctor soon finds that he has little power over it or Igor, both of them living rent-free in his laboratory. It is revealed that the murdering ghost was indeed the Frankenstein monster after all, with Igor hypnotizing the creature with music in order to exact cruel revenge on the town elders who condemned him to death. Hence, with Wolf's unwitting help, Igor successfully kills his last two remaining victims, and the townsfolk are up in arms. For the first time in his life, Wolf learns the fear of potentially losing everything he loved. Inspector Krogh arrives in order to give the Frankenstein family protection from the town mob, but the erratic Wolf remains defiant and hostile. Knowing that the stubborn Wolf is too vain and stupid to save himself, he allows Wolf to work himself up into enough of a desperate frenzy that he will storm off to the lab and kick Igor off the estate. Which is to say that Krogh is fully aware that Igor won't go, and that Wolf will have no choice but to kill him. With Wolf distracted and having already deduced that the monster has been in the castle from the Little Peter's stories of a friendly giant who occasionally visits him, Krogh discovers a secret passageway in the nursery, which also happens to contain the dead body of Wolf's butler, Benson, Edgar Norton. Having been the only other party with knowledge of what Wolf and Igor were up to, Igor had Benson killed in order to tie up any loose ends connecting him to the murders of the town elders. When Wolf returns, Krogh alerts him to this startling discovery. Meanwhile, the monster itself discovers Igor's dead body. He destroys the lab in a fit of rage, but then ventures into the secret passages to find his only other friend in the world, none other than Wolf's son Peter. The monster takes Peter back to the lab, and when they are alerted, both Wolf and Krogh fly to the rescue. Krogh gets there first by following the secret passages, and is able to fend off the monster long enough for Wolf to arrive, climbing the scaffolding of the laboratory, grabbing onto a long rope, and swinging down, drop-kicking the monster into a pit of molten sulfur. The film concludes abruptly with Wolf and his family leaving, bequeathing the deed of the castle to the townspeople to do with as they wish, which they oblige with unanimous cheers. Originally developed under the title After Frankenstein, script writing duties for a Frankenstein sequel were handed over to Willis Cooper. Before moving out to Hollywood in 1936, Cooper was best known as the creator and primary writer of Lights Out, an anthology radio program broadcast by NBC late at night when most other programs were broadcasting music. Lights Out emphasized crime thrillers and supernatural stories, becoming one of the first radio horror programs. Submitting his original draft of the screenplay on October 20th, Cooper's original conception of Son of Frankenstein was significantly different from the final film. It makes much more frequent references to the events of Bride of Frankenstein, for instance, with it being clarified that the story takes place exactly 25 years after the last entry. The monster takes a far more active role in the plot as well. Notably dropped from the final film, it is capable of speech, as it was in the second film. And as in the previous sequel, the monster's primary goal is to compel the living Frankenstein to create a companion for him. It is he, in the original draft, who desecrates the family tomb in order to deliver unto Wolf his father's scientific records. And at the climax of the story, the monster even attempts to create a companion himself, using Wolf's own young son as a living victim. Director Rowland V. Lee was attached to the project around the same time. Born in Findlay, Ohio in September 1859, Lee was destined for a career in Wall Street, as per his family's wishes, but his love of theater and acting lured him to Broadway and summer stock. He began appearing in films for Thomas H. Ince in 1915. At Ince's urging, Lee moved into directing, working on a steady string of profitable films for the Fox Film Corporation. He went to Paramount in 1926 and built up an impressive resume of directing credits, easily making the transition to talking films in the 30s and establishing himself as a much sought-after independent. He found his niche as a producer and director of lavish costume pieces with a film that was, fittingly enough, mentioned in that very Frank S. Nugent article I read from before, The Count of Monte Cristo, distributed by United Artists in 1934. He followed The Count of Monte Cristo with two more adaptations of works by Alexandre Dumas, Cardinal Richelieu and The Three Musketeers, filmed virtually back-to-back and both released in 1935. Signing to Universal in 1938, Lee's first project for the studio was Service Deluxe, a comedy starring Constance Bennett and Vincent Price, the latter in his first starring role. His expeditious handling of the project led him to being tapped by the company to take on Son of Frankenstein. Immediately, however, Lee clashed creatively with the direction that Universal management and Cooper's original draft was taking the sequel. The studio was prepared to begin principal photography immediately on October 28th, assigning the project a relatively modest budget of $250,000. Lee insisted on a budget of at least $300,000 and a page-one rewrite of the screenplay, postponing the beginning of production from November 9th with a projected shooting schedule of 27 days. In a repeat of Universal's troubled prestige pictures of the past, the production rapidly snowballed virtually beyond all control, owing largely to the fact that they had started shooting without a completed script. And Lee himself was constantly making changes on the fly, fine-tuning the story as it was being shot, often delivering sides to his performers mere minutes before cameras needed to begin rolling. Comparing Cooper's original screenplay to the final film, the substantial changes seem to reflect largely upon Lee's decidedly different instinct on how to follow Bride of Frankenstein. What comes through in both the history of the production and the final film itself is that Lee was not simply a seasoned, competent director of another ambitious prestige horror production. He was, himself, a horror fan, whose affinity for the original films steered him in starkly different directions than Cooper and Universal originally wanted to go. The most obvious difference is that while the monster is far less active in the plot and intelligent in Lee's film than he is in Cooper's screenplay, the violence inherent in the part as originally written is significantly toned down. The monster of Cooper's draft murders all but indiscriminately, and even attacks a military outpost for the express purpose of killing a gendarme to deliver to Wolf as a potential body to revive for his companion. By expanding on the initially small part of Igor, Lee also reined in the violence of the story in such a way that was more consistent with a tragic impression of the monster as seen in two previous films. The monster only kills when provoked, or when he is being manipulated by someone more calculating and intelligent than he is. Which is not to say that Cooper's script portrays the monster without compassion either. Indeed, at one point, Wolf even reads from an excerpt of his father's diary, in which the now long-deceased Henry expounds upon the temperament and motivations of his creation. Quote, "We are certain that much of the monster's evil doing is the result of loneliness. It must be a terrible thing to be the only one of one's kind in the world." Cooper himself, a horror fan and an experienced horror writer, is clearly sympathetic to the monster, and attempts to make his tragic loneliness an essential part of the film's gothic themes. Lee, however, probably felt that where Cooper took this theme was simply too on the nose. Parenthetically, that excerpt from Henry Frankenstein's diary also doesn't feel terribly consistent with the characterization of Henry Frankenstein from the first two films. Taking the monster character at the most violent nadir of his desperation, Cooper also leveled any ambiguity that lends him such iconic resonance. Is it nature or nurture that spawns the savage beast and all that? Lee's version of events, developed and honed spontaneously over the course of several months of shooting and editing, is more understated both in terms of its violent content as well as in its allegorical focus. Rather than ravishing the screen with tragedies committed by the monster out of desperation, he subtly plays up the black comic irony of the monster and Wolf's fraternal relationship.
Now he's sick. Make him well, Frankenstein.
I don't know whether
Your father made him. And Heinrich Frankenstein was your father, too.
You mean to imply, then, that that is my brother?
They are, after all, both sons of Frankenstein, though which one is legitimate and which is illegitimate is uncertain. Wolf may be claiming his rightful inheritance according to the law, but it is the monster who rests idly in the patriarchal crypt. Wolf may inherit the secrets of bringing the dead back to life, but one has to wonder, if in posthumously conferring these secrets upon his legitimate heir, the late Henry Frankenstein is not in some way signifying where his true legacy lies, and that Wolf is merely a mechanism for perpetuating it. The nature versus nurture allegory, on the other hand, is represented in the film, but never made overt or commented upon. Think of it like the Kallikak family, but with class consciousness instead of eugenics. One son of Frankenstein, the Baron Wolf, is raised in high society and, despite everything he does wrong, suffers no personal consequences. Indeed, it is always the common people who bear the brunt of his errors, and to a certain extent, it's almost as if the police, represented by Inspector Krogh, really are there more to protect the rich than to bring the guilty to justice. The other son of Frankenstein, the orphaned monster, carries on without any of his brother's privileges, but, on the other hand, in his abjection, is also more identifiable and sympathetic than his aristocratic sibling. Whereas Wolf's privileges molded him into a vain, pretentious oaf with no thought to the suffering of others, be it the villagers, his servant Benson, or even his own family, all of the suffering endured by the monster has not corrupted his soul, which we see rendered in the climax in his final, guileless attempt to make Peter his special companion, not by killing him, as in Cooper's script, but in simply showing him around the house. Eerily enough, showing him all the extravagant aspects of the Frankenstein estate that he knows a lot more personally and intimately than the heir apparent Wolf. Part of what's so fun about Son of Frankenstein in retrospect is how Lee's prototypical horror movie fanboyism is so perfectly blended with his consummate instincts as a filmmaker, approaching the ghoulish subject matter of the film in much the same way as he would an opulent period drama and adventure. His film also anticipates and delineates between two types of horror fans. Those who, in the strictest definition of a fan, have a merely uncritical obsession with the genre, and, as a subset of this group, those who find special fondness in also reading, analyzing, and deconstructing horror. Horror cinema has, of course, always been self-aware to a degree, whether we're talking about the ghoulish teasers at the opening of the original Frankenstein, James Whale's heightening of the camp factor with its sequel, or the homage to the Grand Guignol we find in both Warner Brothers' Dr. X as well as MGM's Mad Love. But Son of Frankenstein, in its playing up the symbolic fraternity between Wolf and the monster, may be one of the first horror films that, informed by the director's own sense of fandom, we might call definitively self-aware rather than merely cheeky or opportunistic. You all remember the old bit, right? Every horror fan at one point or another has the joy of snobbishly telling a non-horror fan that Frankenstein is not the name of the monster, but of the scientist who created him. It's just that the monster became so associated with the Universal film franchise that most people who have not read Mary Shelley's novel nor even seen a Frankenstein movie know the difference. Well, here you have it in our own very introduction to Wolf and Elsa Frankenstein, a self-aware joke on this cultural phenomenon, as it had already been noted in 1939.
It was the unforeseen blunder of a stupid assistant that gave his creation the brain of a killer instead of a normal one. Huh. And how my father was made to suffer for that mistake. His name has become synonymous with horror and monsters. Why, 9 out of 10 people call that misshapen creature of my father's experiments
Frankenstein.
But again, the thing is that every horror fan, if they are truly a horror fan, has to confront at some point that calling the monster Frankenstein isn't really a misnomer either. Thematically, the monster is the son of Frankenstein, and has just as much rightful claim to his father's surname as any son born of Congress with a live woman's body, as opposed to the bodies of many dead men. A true horror fan to his core, Lee took Cooper's script and made this the dramatic undercurrent of his entire film. Lee's clashes with Universal weren't solely creative either. They were also ethical in nature. In Lugosi lore, his combative relationship with the studio is especially revered. When he wasn't slumming it in Poverty Row thrillers, Lugosi was consistently underappreciated by the very studio that had been all but saved from bankruptcy 8 years ago by his most defining role. When horror roles dried up, the actor had entered the most traumatic period of his life, both personally and professionally. Now that horror was back in vogue, though he found himself originally playing a fairly small role in Universal's latest Frankenstein production, he was sure to get top billing in some capacity, if only as a publicity move. And yet, whereas Basil Rathbone and Boris Karloff were receiving $5,000 and $3,750 a week for a month's worth of principal photography respectively, Lugosi was picking up a pitiful lump sum of $500 for just 1 week of shooting. A true horror fan who knew the iconic actor's worth and seeing right through Universal's calculated exploitation of his financial desperation, Lee was incensed. According to Robert Kremer, author of Lugosi, The Man Behind the Cape, the director personally told Lugosi's wife Lillian, quote, "I'm going to show those goddamn SOBs that they can't do that to Bela. I'll keep him on the set from the very first day of shooting to the last minute. I'll be damned if he doesn't make as much as Karloff from the film. You leave it to me." Suddenly, Lugosi found his part ballooning from a small henchman to one of the most pivotal in the picture. Lugosi, for his part, attacks the role with a gusto not seen in him since Robert Florey's murders in the Rue Morgue. The once handsome Hungarian star, haggard by time, neglect, and self-destruction, embodies the psychopathic Igor with all the venom of a man who really does have a list of foes he'd like to see have their skulls smashed and their hearts burst. When he mocks the village elders, he may as well be laughing in the face of all of Hollywood.
Well, you watch him. And if he starts to do anything like his father, and you don't tell us, I'll see that you hang again.
You alone? It took 8 men before to say I was to be hanged.
Well, the same 8 will find you guilty again.
So?
The same 8 aren't here, Weber.
No?
Well, I'm one of the 8, and I'll be one again with pleasure.
You Neumüller. You were one.
And I, too.
Yes, you too. Lang. That's right. I remember. That's all here now, eh?
Yes. The other 6 are all dead.
They die dead. I die live.
Quiet. That'll be all, Igor. Go back to Castle Frankenstein and be careful. Hey! You spit on me.
I'm sorry, I coughed. You see, bone gets stuck in my throat.
Lee's last-minute writing of the film, a combination of dramatic perfectionism and total defiance of a studio who didn't appreciate horror and its new icons the way he did, compounded upon the already immense undertaking of the film, which featured several elaborate special effects sequences. On November 30th, it was announced in The Hollywood Reporter that Universal had doubled the film's editing and musician staff so that cutting and scoring could be done around the clock. Meanwhile, production itself was still ongoing. The original wrap date of December 10th was pushed forward to December 17th, and then that deadline was missed. The principal cast, Bela included, had their engagements extended through December 29th, and the production finally wrapped around 1:15 a.m. on January 5th, a full 46 days since shooting began, and just 2 days shy of the film's original projected preview date. Now all that was left was to finish editing and scoring the film, which originally ran well over the finished cut's 100-minute runtime. As it exists currently, Son of Frankenstein remains exceptionally long for a horror film of its period, and its immersive, elaborately plotted scope only contributes to its staying power. To Universal executives, of course, for whom a horror film was worth between an hour and 80 minutes of screen time at best, Lee's true prestige horror epic must have seemed like a Frankenstein's monster in and of itself. But like the Frankenstein monster, There was no going back from the diabolical creation. Cutting was literally being done right down to the wire so that the film could meet its ominous target premiere of January 13th. All in all, the production cost the studio $420,000, making it the most expensive horror film Universal ever produced. Son of Frankenstein would go on to be a financial and surprise critical success, but Lee was not able to get his faithful horror fans' vision to screen without tarnishing his reputation in the eyes of Universal's executives. His repeat performance of going over budget and lagging behind schedule on both The Sun Never Sets and Tower of London, also released in 1939, did little to endear him further. In their book Universal Horrors, film historians Tom Weaver, Michael Brunas, and John Brunas speculate that it was Lee's excesses, coupled with the similar problems faced by director Joe May on his own horror and horror-adjacent projects for the studio, those being The House of Fear, also 1939, as well as The Invisible Man Returns and The House of Seven Gables from 1940, led corporate president Nate Bloomberg and production chief Cliff Work to significantly scale back the ambitions of future shockers. 1939 and 1940 would be the last years of the horror prestige picture. During the war years, the genre would be dramatically streamlined, menageries of gothic horror replaced by action-oriented B-programmers that emphasize monsters over monstrosity. But Son of Frankenstein still leaves an indelible impact on the viewer, a feat made all the more impressive when one considers the act that Lee had to follow. As the director of both Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, James Whale brought a flamboyant black comic edge to the horror film. With disorienting camera angles, fast-paced editing techniques, and operatic performances that project all the way to the back of the theater even when the camera is right up in the actors' faces, his films did not merely depict insane subject matter, but assumed the perspective of a truly deranged mind, one that refused to disguise its love of bad behavior and its schadenfreude at the suffering of fools. There's even something of a libertarian streak to Whale's work. Though bound by conventions to deliver moralistic conclusions, one cannot mistake the blatant allegory made between Henry Frankenstein's debauched experiments and the quest of the artist to defy all conventions and leash their unalloyed violent vision upon an unsuspecting world, taking glee in being deemed on the outside of normal society and its suffocating pretenses. None of this is to say that Lee's direction of Son of Frankenstein, given its protracted, troubled development and production history, is not exquisite. The film is so assured in its presentation, every eccentricity of its plot and characterization so seemingly incontrovertible. Take away one aspect of it and it would all fall apart. But it holds together, defying any notion that it could be any other way than as it is. Of that $420,000 spent, every cent appears on the screen, whether it's in George Robinson's sumptuous cinematography, Jack Otterson and Russell A. Gossman's elegant expressionistic art and set direction, or Frank Skinner's lively original score. But besides bare-bones details of the plot, Lee's film takes virtually no notes from Whale. Even at its most dynamic, his and Robinson's camera movements are understated. If anything, the visual presentation of the film, especially in the first half, is plainly theatrical in its bent, more akin to Todd Browning's compromised Dracula than James Whale's operatic Frankenstein films. This is to say that while Lee executes a definite style, he is not, like James Whale, a stylist, which renders Son of Frankenstein a wholly distinct and equally artistically impressive undertaking for completely different reasons than its predecessor. There's even a certain argument to be made that Lee's approach to horror cinema, spanning a decade's distance between itself and Whale's work, is necessarily superior. If the listener will be patient with me, I can't help but recall Susan Sontag's seminal 1965 essay on style. In it, Sontag makes a very clear distinction between what she defines as style and the distinct concept of stylization, which she addresses as often being problematically conflated. An artist's style, she writes, is from a technical point of view nothing other than the particular idiom in which he deploys the forms of his art. For Sontag, style is not something that need be executed consciously or deliberately. All works necessarily have style, because all concepts, all emotions, being necessarily ineffable, must then necessarily be represented by the artist in a specific form. This form may be derivative or redundant, but following in the idiom of other representations is not the same as the absence of style. Indeed, that tradition of representations is a style in and of itself. Nor should style, which is to say form, be judged on the extent to which it merely builds upon or breaks away from conventions. In turning the ineffable into the representative, style has more than just a representative purpose, in that it insists upon a subject, focuses our attention, and allows us to partake of the work of art not just in its individual parts, but in its totality, exciting and enthralling us with the illusion of it being totally consistent and whole. Stylization, on the other hand, occurs when style and subject are distinguished. Stylized works may have a very sophisticated aesthetic surface, but they also often have an ironic, ambivalent attitude towards subject matter. According to Sontag, just as style must be understood in historical terms, so too must stylization. As subject matter becomes exhausted by repeated formalistic treatments, artists building upon previous works inevitably become somewhat disassociated from subject matter, become more preoccupied with aesthetics. Consequently, stylized works are often narrow and repetitive in their form, the stylist reaching into the same bag of tricks for widely varying subjects. Sontag is confident that while parts of a stylized work can be visually or otherwise aesthetically brilliant, their ambivalence to subject matter results in works that are overall disoriented and alienating to the spectator. Quoting again, "No doubt in a culture pledged to the utility, particularly the moral utility of art, burdened with the useless need to fence off solemn art from arts which provide amusement, the eccentricities of stylized art provide a valid and valuable satisfaction." Sontag describes this type of satisfaction with stylization in her essay on Camp, by the way. Yet it is evident that stylized art, palpably an art of excess, lacking harmoniousness, can never be of the very greatest kind. Now, I don't agree that an art of excess or an inharmonious work, as it were, can never be a work of art of the greatest kind. But I think attending to the differences between Whale's Bride of Frankenstein and Lee's Son of Frankenstein marks a perfect encapsulation of the dynamic between stylization and style that Sontag writes about. Bride of Frankenstein is indeed an art of excess, an art from which we derive satisfaction due to its constant, disorienting aesthetic eccentricities of production design, performance, cinematography, montage, etc. But it is also, perhaps not so surprisingly, a deeply ambivalent work that, I think it can be fairly argued, functions more as an assemblage of elaborate sequences than it does a coherent work which captivates us to the extent that it makes us feel that the form it takes and the experience it carries us through appears incontrovertible. For as much as it can be satisfying, Bride of Frankenstein can also be quite alienating. Extrapolate whatever artistic statement you want from it, it just doesn't feel, from the form that Whale directs it through, like anything that the film is about matters. And I don't mean matters in the sense that the film lacks substance or whatever in that old style over substance argument. Sontag herself would have a few words to say about that. I do not mean matters in any kind of moralistic terms. I mean matters purely in the sense of emotional captivation. In the decades since its initial release, Bride of Frankenstein has been rightfully hailed as a top-tier classic of horror, as well as, more narrowly, a queer cult classic, a flamboyant aesthetic statement of sorts by an out-gay filmmaker in the 30s that revels in a sense of outsider status. But at the end of the day, does all of Whale's stylization lead to our identification with the other? Do we feel a pang of sorrow for the bride herself when this misbegotten creature is destroyed by her creators, Or do we identify with her more as another elaborate spectacle unto herself rather than a character? In other words, does Whale's stylization enthrall us in some new, intuitive, emotional knowledge, some understanding of otherness? Or is otherness itself reduced to disaffected aesthetics devoid of humanity? The best way I can convey the extent to which I think Lee exceeds Whale with Son of Frankenstein comes down to one of the most persistent influences upon American horror films of the 1930s, which is German Expressionism. Whether we're talking about Bride of Frankenstein or The Black Cat or Mad Love or Murders in the Rue Morgue, early horror is replete with cinematography and production designs that are either heavily influenced by German Expressionism or are, indeed, the result of German expatriates to Hollywood utilizing the same or similar techniques of design on these productions. The influence of German Expressionism in Son of Frankenstein is the most obvious in the design of the interior of Castle Frankenstein. But even when taken in the evolving tradition of German Expressionist influence in American horror, the set designs in Son of Frankenstein are not something to be easily paralleled. It is not just that they are composed of stark contrast between light and dark, or that the architecture of set pieces is distorted to elicit unease or suggest a deranged subjectivity. Where Son of Frankenstein excels is in how precisely Lee is able to corral these distorted, stylized features in a way that never loses sight of situating the spectator in an experience that feels dramatically credible, where it feels like the set pieces of the castle are not merely distorted, highly aestheticized parts, but are inextricable from a more understated and naturalistic element of the film's overall form, creating a highly immersive whole where we are always intuitively, emotionally invested rather than merely beguiled by occasional eccentricity or showmanship. One particular set piece, the antechamber of the castle, contains a staircase that we perceive first in a wide shot as the Frankenstein family is entering, and then in a wide medium shot at the base of the staircase as Peter is being taken up to bed. Though in both shots the design of the staircase appears repulsive, ugly, distorted, between the shots, what once appeared distorted about the staircase suddenly appears, relatively speaking, balanced and logical, whereas a formally balanced aspect of it, such as the angular direction of a banister, now appears newly distorted. The object itself changes its sense of what is wrong with it because of where the camera is placed, which means that although we are essentially seeing a repetition of the same technique, the technique itself is being applied in a radically different way, and in a way that we're not necessarily conscious of while we're watching it, but we intuit it. We feel this subtle, disturbing shift, not necessarily in the disturbing effect of the set design or of the camera angle or the composition itself, but in a more subtle way of the set itself changing through our perception of it. In this way, Lee's direction ensures that he can elicit similar emotions of unease in the spectator without ever being repetitive. What's more, as opposed to the previous Frankenstein films, the depiction of the castle is never merely intensive, but also extensive. We see more of it as Wolf goes about the charade of his day-to-day life, and of course, Lee's camera is also doing a much better job of mapping out the geography of the castle, where characters are moving in relationship to one another than Whale ever practiced with his much more disoriented, fractured style of direction and editing. And some set pieces, such as a virtually all-black, void-like hallway, appear only for one shot. But these details are enough so that the disorientation and revulsion provoked by these otherworldly set pieces are compounded precisely by the fact that they feel real to us. They feel lived in. They are disturbing both because they are unusual, but also because Lee chooses to present them strategically in a relatively restrained, unaffected, and even naturalistic manner. Most German expressionist influence in American horror films of the Golden Age, most notably Murders in the Rue Morgue, is overall too elaborate, too showy, too self-indulgent, such that this influence can only, at best, provide a reveling in the morbid or the unusual. Which is fine, but the actual feeling for what is occurring in this distorted world, a captivating sense of being torn between our revulsion at the unusual and our attraction to it, our conflicted fear and sympathy towards otherness, leaves much to be desired. Because the form of Lee's movie is not stylized, as it were, because there is not this distance between the style and the subject, because the relation of the style to the subject is not ambivalent, as it were. There may be disturbing implications to the plot or stabs of macabre humor, but there is no ambivalence. We laugh, but we also feel a pang of sorrow because the world in which we have been enthralled is one in which Wolf never faces true justice for his evil deeds, and the monster is condemned to a fiery pit in his stead. And intuitively, we partake of the emotional knowledge that there is, instead, a horrifying symmetry between the fraternal tragedy portrayed in Son of Frankenstein and the cruel world that we inhabit. Son of Frankenstein inspires connection with the filmic art, whereas it can be argued many of its predecessors could only inspire flashes of interest at aesthetics alone. Before I fly too off the handle, let me just say I'm not actually terribly invested in whether Bride of Frankenstein or Son of Frankenstein is the better film, but I perceive in the dynamic between the films a striking prescience of horror to come well into the present day. There does appear to be, in general, when one accepts the generic majority of mediocre and cynical works, two competing traditions of horror, the stylized and ambivalent kind, and the kind of consummate form that, unlike its contrary, is not yet exhausted by the repetition of subject matter, is not ambivalent to it, is not totally obsessed with the sophistication of form. Like, there's Blumhouse, and then there's A24, right? And it's not about which type of horror movie is inherently better than the other, but it does seem, precisely as Sontag wrote decades ago, that the horror films that receive the most praise belong to the stylists. These are films that most indulge the moralistic desire for art to be a statement rather than an experience, to affect substance for a culture that is increasingly distracted, ambivalent, and unable to focus its emotional energy to an experience that inspires an intuitive knowledge of our own humanity. Styles, the idiomatic expressions of form, have indeed accelerated to the point where it appears that everything has been exhausted, that there is nowhere else to go, that we are falling into an alienated emotional disarray with our popular arts. We cling fast instead to statements because of their utility in staking out our hostile position, in ensuring our defense against a world that we feel is increasingly hostile to us and is being stripped bare of feeling, is itself becoming more ambivalent, more disaffected, more, of course, obsessed with aesthetic surfaces, but with no focus or attachment to the ineffable human and emotional concept that the aesthetic is supposed to represent and realize and cohere for us. But then again, that really is what Monster Craze Memoirs is all about. Inasmuch as I love reading and analyzing these old movies, their value is, above all, to rekindle the knowledge of popular art as primarily emotional experiences rather than utilitarian statements. We turn to films like Son of Frankenstein and ask to be reminded of the forgotten, the ineffable knowledge that it contains. And indeed, to perhaps find new knowledges that, like the monster Frankenstein itself, have not died and can never really be killed. They merely go dormant, they mutate and wait for us. They wait for us to descend into the crypts of our forefathers, and in the grave marked for us discover a mirror of our own monstrosity. We are horrified by this image, but then in its repression, we recognize the abused and neglected halves of ourselves. And then from that horror, just maybe, there comes an emotional inspiration.